I'd like to take a moment to thank the Blockchain Academy. The Blockchain Academy is an educational training firm offering blockchain training to the enterprise. The Blockchain Academy offers courses for both management and developers, offering delivery online and in live classrooms. The Blockchain Academy works with enterprise clients to create and deliver innovative training programs globally. They recently announced a new blockchain course targeted towards attorneys. To learn more about the Blockchain Academy, visit them at www.theblockchainacademy.com.
This is the Blockchain 360 podcast. Blockchain 360 is a podcast of interviews and discussions about the current state and direction of blockchain. Thank you for joining us today. If this is your first time listening, then thank you for coming. The Blockchain 360 podcast is produced weekly for your enjoyment, and show notes are found at our website, blockchain360.co. Come back often and feel free to add the podcast to your favorite RSS feed or iTunes. You can also follow us on Twitter at Blockchain360. All links discussed today are included in the show notes.
Hi, my name is Brian Nielsen, and I am your host here at Blockchain 360, where we talk about everything blockchain. And today's guest is Joseph Willams. He is the Governor's Information Communication Technology Sector Lead at the Office of Economic Development and Competitiveness in the state of Washington. And he's a former executive with Microsoft and Sun Microsystems. Dr. Willams served as the Dean of the School of Business and Government and Economics at Seattle Pacific University before joining Commerce. And he has a distinguished career in the tech industry, in academia, and the public sector, which includes extensive experience working with angel investings and software as a service companies. Joseph, thank you. Is it Joseph or Joe? Do you want to go by?
Let's go by Joseph.
All right, Joseph. Well, welcome to Blockchain 360. I had the pleasure of meeting you in Santa Clara, actually, at a conference where I'd spoken earlier in the day, and you had then spoken later in the day with me.
That's right. Blockchain Expo.
That's right. And I was actually very impressed with what you guys were doing up in the state of Washington. And so really, I want to ask you just a couple of questions here. Let's first start with, how is it that you got into this role, and how is it that this role started taking on, attention and gave attention to blockchain?
Well, the governor has 6 sectors that he's identified as strategic for the state. Aerospace with Boeing, of course, is one, and tech
naturally
is one, and agriculture and maritime, those things. And it's a hard job to fill because, the state doesn't pay particularly well. And so they were really looking for somebody who would think of this as a service project as part of their, employment portfolio. And
Sure.
I thought it was a good time to get involved in the tech industry in the state of Washington. And it's a good way for me to give something back and have an impact. So left the deanship and took this job on.
And when did you do this?
I started in May of last year. So it's been about a year and a half.
Oh, so when you were the dean at Seattle Pacific University, did you do anything with blockchain at that time, or is this really a new space for you?
So in my own portfolio of work, I was starting to research blockchain. But SPU itself didn't do anything around blockchain. The first university I ever worked with that showed any strong interest in that was Seattle University, which has a finance professor who's very interested in blockchain. And I met her about a year and a half ago as well.
Okay.
Academia has been slow to pick this up. I was at Consensus in May of this year. And Duke seemed to have the most forward-looking program thinking about blockchain and how it could be used. So academia is slow.
Yes, actually, it's a Campbell. What's his last name? I forgot. He's the professor down there who's spearheading it.
That's exactly right. I can't remember his last name either.
He's going to kill me because when he hears this, he's going to go, "Wait a minute, you and I've spoken." But yes, he has a very forward-looking program there, and there's a few others. Berkeley actually has a great one. Princeton has made some nice forays into it. UPenn actually has some nice programs that are being developed. And
You say that because I'm a Berkeley alum with an economics degree, and I haven't seen anything from the university.
well, I think that most of what's coming out from them is, I don't know if it's part of the academic side. My understanding is that it's part of a master program. It's not really for the undergraduates, but there is a master program, and they have a very, very active user group there.
Yeah.
That is doing quite a bit in terms of sharing knowledge and promoting blockchain. But you're right. I was actually very surprised that when I was in Santa Clara at the conference, a lot of people came up to me and they said, we're desperate for training here. So what can you do to help us? And I was like, wait a minute, this should not be the question people ask in the tech center of the universe. So
it highlights, though, an interesting problem around blockchain, which is it takes a while for people to ramp up and actually enter the workforce. And largely, it's an ill-defined set of skills that people need to bring to the table in order to get a job. Working for here locally, we have the Dragon Chain, for example, and I couldn't tell you exactly what skill set they're looking for as they try to build up their group, and that gets real interesting. I know what Microsoft and Amazon want because they're both trying to do offerings through AWS or Azure, but Avalara, which is another Seattle company, they have a blockchain group, and I honestly couldn't tell you what skills they're using, which is very distressing in a way.
It is. You think about it, you would think that we would be able to articulate something that's based around technology and saying, this is what we need, and this is exactly what we're looking for.
Yeah.
So let's though focus on the state of Washington. So what initiatives are coming out of Washington that others would like to actually know about?
Well, if you differentiate between Bitcoin and blockchain, we had in our last legislative session, we had some Bitcoin legislation that came out around money transfer. How you register money transfer agents?
Is that just for Bitcoin or for all cryptocurrencies?
It's all crypto. Okay. And we use Bitcoin sort of as a proxy for all crypto.
Fair enough.
And so we did that, and we got that bill through about the time I came on board, actually, this year, in terms of the legislative flow of things. And we didn't have any legislation around blockchain itself. And I don't anticipate in the coming session, which starts in 2 weeks, that we'll see any blockchain legislation. But we could see more crypto legislation. There's a lot of unanswered issues around crypto. We'll either have to wait for the courts to figure it out, or we'll have to be proactive with some legislation.
Yeah, the whole idea of crypto and its white hot and so volatile markets are just, they're actually, I think, doing a disservice to blockchain simply because it's taking away the attention from the technology and just focusing on the speculative aspect of what is out there.
But I heard, I don't know how true this was on your side of the country, but out here, crypto was a big Christmas conversation for a lot of people.
Oh, yeah. Well, the markets. Bitcoin itself, it peaked at 20,000 and fell all the way down to 10,000. From that peak high and low, I think was 5 days. Absolutely. I think there was a great amount of correction in the marketplace with regards to all cryptos. And it was quite a ride, I think, for those who've invested in it.
As a result, you're spot on about this distracting from blockchain, because crypto is such a news story that people forget about the underlying enabling technology.
Right. So what things are happening in the state of Washington that is, since there's not a legislative bills that are coming out, what things are you then focusing on as it relates to blockchain?
Well, I'm recommending that we create a task force to look at the use of blockchain in elections and in state record keeping. So,
Record keeping and voting. Interesting.
So two, I think, low-hanging fruit. There's a lot of issues here, and we just can't push legislation without researching it first. So that's why I think we need to have a task force. I would love to see some legislation pop up about validating signatures and contracts that are secured through blockchain.
Right.
And like to give that the same legal status as, what DocuSign gets and that sort of thing.
Right. Exactly.
And then we've seen a little bit of interest in smart contracts that use blockchain, and we need to take a look at that, because that will, of course, cut out intermediaries, and then you start to ask questions about, well, how do we validate these contracts? How do we enforce them? What does it look like? What are the rules of evidence? So these are the kinds of things we're looking at through the legislative process, rather than just waiting for the courts to take.
Well, do you have any state congressional people that are spearheading this, or is it kind of still a quiet, discussion held, not even in serious places? I mean, I don't even know what to say. I mean, you've at least identified very strongly where blockchain could have a major impact. But is there a champion out there within the state of Washington that's going to be moving this forward and spearheading this change?
There are. So Senator Joe Fain is probably our leading legislative expert on blockchain. He's attended sessions in D.C. and I think maybe New York on trying to ramp up on the potential uses of blockchain. And he's, I think, number 4 or 5 in the upper house Republican Party. And then our youngest legislator, Representative Melanie Stambaugh, she's real interested in blockchain, and Joe's very young as well. So I think what we're seeing is a lot of interest from our younger legislators, maybe not necessarily our more experienced legislators, but we definitely have legislative attention on the technology.
Well, that kind of gets me back to what you were saying, that one of the areas that you wanted, which was, of course, in voting. How are they going to address things like digital identity as to identifying who are those people that are voting? I mean, are they just going to take the voting records and just say this is the validation, and then how do you go about saying that one person is actually doing it? I mean, it makes sense from a statewide perspective. So you can't have somebody who lives, say, in the north or the east, and then has a house in the west and has actually, registered in both places. That makes a lot of sense from that standpoint. But how do you even make sure that the person voting is the person voting?
Well, that's exactly, you've hit the key issue, which is identity, right? And so right now, all states, not just Washington, have an issue with how do you handle out-of-state voters. So residents of Washington who happen to be out of state and they need to vote. And we don't have an online voting system here. And so they either have to request a ballot or they have to work out some accommodation. And this is particularly true of our men and women in the armed forces who are serving abroad, right? And we have a lot of them. This is a big military state. And so we need to have an identity model that allows us to secure the information for verification. And then somehow or another, we've got to use that verified identity to either issue a ballot or to cast the ballot. I'm not sure which way this will end up going. And then so it would be this identifier that validates the voter. Now, how we get that identification done, I don't know yet. That'll have to come out through some legislation, and the Secretary of State will have to figure out what she's willing to work with in terms of acceptable identification. But I don't think it's going to be that difficult. I actually I foresee the more interesting problem being, for example, once you vote using blockchain, technically I could revote. I could change my mind, right? Something could happen during the election. I can go back and resubmit my ballot. And a lot of
it would be a modifier. The question would be is would the state of Washington allow for people to modify their vote? Because what blockchain does is it timestamps whatever the selection is.
Correct.
So if there was a vote, so let's say you have person A and person B, and you say, oh, I'm going to vote for person A. Well, there's your vote. It's timestamped. I mean, does the state of Washington allow for you to go back and change your vote currently?
I don't actually know, but I do. I don't know because elections isn't my area. But I do know there's quite a few states that don't allow you to do that. So one of the interesting issues around blockchain is if we enable a blockchain enabled ballot, can the voter change their mind if something horrible happens in the last week of the election and they decide to change their vote? So in a way, it empowers the electorate differently than traditionally happens with casting a paper ballot.
Right.
And I see blockchain as having a lot of potential here. The identity issue isn't just a voter thing, by the way. It's a birth registration issue as well.
Well, that's the responsibility of the states, is to actually issue that.
That's right.
I mean, my understanding is that, and I was actually surprised, as I always thought a U.S. passport was the ultimate in identification, and then I was slightly pulled aside and said, that is only for travel, and it really is technically not identification internally, and that it's really a states' rights issue, that states issue identity and states issue, they control the birth certificates and the marriage certificates and the death certificates. And that's really all a part of the state rights.
So I think it's actually an interplay of federal rights around your social security number and your passport, and the state rights around birth registration and things like a driver's license.
Right.
And the Fed has some regulatory authority over whether a state's identification regime is legitimate at the standards the feds require. And as it happens, by the way, the state of Washington driver's license doesn't meet the threshold, and it needs to be enhanced in order for us to meet the travel requirements of 2018.
Oh, really? Interesting.
Yeah.
I was unaware that there were states that still had that. I mean, New Jersey actually adopted, that's where I live, adopted this 16-point system probably 10 or 11 years ago, shortly after 9/11. So it might even be 15 years ago. And it's very, very restrictive. I mean, even if you're going and just renewing your driver's license, you have to take so many documents in to actually prove who you are.
So then you get to the very interesting problem of how do I go from the fact that you're an identified resident or citizen to a blockchain solution. And we would want to make that as painless as possible, and we wouldn't want to make it look like we're trying to take people's guns away from them or something,
Right.
There's a lot of political issues that have to be dealt with in a very sensitive way on how to make that happen. So even though the technology may be capable and adequate, it may be the case that for political reasons it's not acceptable. So we've got to pay a lot of attention to this.
Now, there have been states like Delaware that issued their blockchain initiative for the registration of corporate records and corporate actions. They seem to be fairly far along in terms of that project. Has the state of Washington started any proof of concept type things from the state level?
Not yet. So I'm well aware of what the blockchains are in Delaware is up to on the corporate registration side.
Yep.
We're not really a primary state for doing corporate registrations.
No, I just use that as an example of a state that's actually choosing at least a market segment. I mean, you have to admit that state of Washington has two. I mean, you mentioned 6 areas, but aerospace and technology are, they're kings there in the state of Washington, at least from an outsider's viewpoint. So
you've asked a great question, and actually we have an answer. So we're focusing initially on blockchain uses in energy and in food safety.
Oh, excellent.
So we're only in study mode where there's no regulations and no incentives or anything, but we are looking at both. We're a big exporter of agricultural products, and increasingly, countries like China want to see a more sophisticated food safety system, and we think blockchain has enormous potential there. And we're probably the leading state in the country around clean energy, and we think there's a big use for blockchain around things like carbon offsets and tax credits and proof of origin around electricity, whether it's wind generated or hydro or whatever.
I would like to take a moment to thank one of our sponsors, the Blockchain Academy. The Blockchain Academy is an educational training firm offering blockchain training for developers and stakeholders. The Blockchain Academy is currently offering the following live courses: Blockchain Security, Hyperledger Developer Workshop, and Ethereum 0 to D app. Visit the Blockchain Academy's website for course outlines and course dates. The Blockchain Academy's courses can be delivered as a company-specific training, tailor-made to fit your organizational needs, delivered both on-site and online. The Blockchain Academy's training is cost-effective, flexible, and can be conducted in a manner that best suits your organizational needs. To learn more about the Blockchain Academy, visit them at www.theblockchainacademy.com. Well, what are the main challenges that you think that the state of Washington has to overcome to start doing these things? And is it going to be a domino type of effect where there's going to be a lot of these little studies put aside and studied, and then once there's an implementation of one, it'll just kind of like do that domino effect and just do a more massive enterprise rollout?
At a practical level, states really lack the talent and the investment capital to innovate. And so we're going to rely on our vendors. We have a very rich ecosystem of vendors here in Seattle and in the general Pacific Northwest. And my expectation is they will bring forward solutions for everything from smart city to voting to regulatory compliance, right? They'll come out with solutions, and then we'll sift through these vendor products to either adopt or recommend solutions. I just don't see us as having the investment dollars to design anything on our own. And largely in America, we kind of rely on the private sector for most innovation.
Okay. Do you think that AI is going to be a part of this solution?
AI is going to be a part of everything going forward, I think. And the question becomes, how do we use it? And we could use machine learning and deep learning, for example, to identify fraud or to identify misuse of things that are coming out of the blockchain. I mean, the blockchain, which is largely immutable, isn't perfect. And
right, it's not.
Yeah. And so how do we deal with its lack of perfection? And I think AI is going to play a big role here.
Now, one of the things that I noted and remember from your participation on that panel is you were talking about some of the risks associated with blockchain. And I think the example you gave was on cryptocurrency. How does a family like recover? What are the recovery methodologies for a person who passes away and they want to transfer these assets? Do you see that is going to be a legislative issue that's going to be tackled about who's controlling these things and how are they registered, and how can they be possibly transferred?
Well, there's no doubt that if the easiest scenario would be I'm a cryptocurrency investor. I use a cold storage USB drive, right, to keep track of everything. And then because we're a boating state, you die in a boating accident, and somehow or another your body's never found, and they can't find the USB. Right, I'm coming up with a bad scenario.
Right. That's a good bad scenario.
But it's a good bad scenario. So now I don't have you. Right. I don't have your cold storage thumb drive. I don't. How do I recover this? How do we make it as part of the estate? The state itself has a compelling interest in adjudicating your estate. We want to adjudicate your estate, but how do we get access to this stuff? What does it look like? What do the heirs have to do? If it's in cold storage, which is a worst case scenario, how do you even know?
Right.
Other than maybe that person told somebody in the family that there's a legacy there. If it's sitting in a wallet somewhere, how do we recover? If it's in a Fidelity crypto wallet, for example, how do you recover that? Does that automatically become part of the estate, or does Fidelity assert some sort of fiduciary control over that? All of this is unsettled, and I'm going to guess it gets settled through the courts first, because it's hard to do legislation when you've got no sense of adjudication.
Right.
So there's a lot of unknowns here. I mean, you probably heard me talk about what happens if a particular chain gets orphaned.
Oh, that one. I was just going to bring that up. That when you said that, it was like my jaw fell to the floor. I'm like, I hadn't even thought of that. It's like, I was taking probably the enthusiastic aspect of this new technology and saying, well, of course it's going to exist forever. But then when you said that, I was like, yeah, what do you do when it's orphaned?
Yeah, I mean,
who's going to even support it?
What if the incentives aren't out there to get any miners to actually write to the chain?
Right.
That's a very real problem. And then I got no record of these things, and
well, it disappears.
It just kind of disappears. Yeah, and then the legal status of private blockchains is going to be another big thing. At least with public, we understand the validation model, but how do you validate a private blockchain? What does that look like? What legal status of something written to a private blockchain where I control the block, or I control?
Right. Well, this is going to also then, of course, expand. I mean, anytime we talk about blockchain, it covers more than just a simple implementation. I mean, we start with things like in this conversation, we're covering digital identities. We're discussing how are we going to manage records, and how are we managing blockchains? How are we managing legal aspects to it? What are the impacts of smart contracts? Because, I mean, from the real estate standpoint, I just refinanced my house to a very, very short-term mortgage and a very low rate. Very happy about that. But it's like title companies will cease to exist. There's no need to have a title company if you have blockchain.
Yeah, I've heard that argument. You actually have to work it all the way through. I think it reduces. So title companies exist to mitigate risk. And I think the blockchain, because it's objectively valid, reduces the risk inherently. But title companies still have to will still exist in order to remove the remaining risk. And also, I mean, we haven't really come up with a way to prove that a property transaction in a chain is actually encumbered by all of the liens and everything that would accrue to the property. And title insurance actually makes sure that you're insured against these liens and other claims on the property.
Right. Unregistered claims. You're right.
And so,
good point.
So they're still going to be there. However, this said, if I was a title company executive, I'd be having a well-paid task force looking at this.
Right. Don't disagree with you on that. So your department then, are you like identifying these opportunities for the state of Washington?
I am.
Or are you? So like, what are the areas of focus that have at least captured your attention, and have you kind of created a rollout order for those things?
Well, I've got 7 topical areas that I think are worthy of attention. And the first, I'll give you all 7. First is we have a lot of smart city initiatives, and I think we should be talking at a state level about how blockchain could be an enabler for smart city, which ultimately becomes smart county, which ultimately becomes smart state, right? So blockchain has a role to play there, still to be determined, but we should be looking at it. I already mentioned citizen services. This is voting, reporting, registration, that kind of stuff. Third area is going to be regulatory compliance, which is reporting and enforcement. There's already very interesting blockchain models that I've seen out of the academic world on this. So that's an area of interest. And identity management, as we already talked about, is a 4th area. Everybody talks about blockchain contracts. So a 5th area is going to be how do we manage those contracts and how do we adjudicate them? The state provides a lot of services, and I think the blockchain could. The 6th area will be provider registry. How do we register Medicaid, housing, those kinds of services. And I think blockchain plays a role there. And then seventh and not least is, can we use the blockchain to look at performance management? So we've got a lot of vendors who provide housing, a lot of service providers who provide housing. Can we use the blockchain as a way, or a blockchain as a way to evaluate how well they're performing? And I think the answer is tentatively yes. So
I would agree with you. So in the order of these, you listed them 1 through 7. Is that the order that you think that the state of Washington should give its attention to in that order, or was that just an arbitrary order?
That was an arbitrary order. I would say we're probably going to lead with identity management and citizen services. Would be
okay. And so you told me not to ask you about projections in the future. The projection I'm going to ask is, when, and you can take wide berth on this, when do you think that you'll start to see something in the state of Washington actually happen?
On blockchain specifically, as opposed to crypto?
Yeah, I'm not talking about crypto.
All right.
So from a pure blockchain, like you identified the citizen services, is that going to be 18 months away? 36 months away, 10 years away? What do you think it's going to be?
Great question. So state of Washington runs a biennial legislative session, and we're about to start our short one in 2018. So the next big biennium starts in 2019. My guess, if you were going to ask for a well-considered opinion, would be in the 2019 session. One or both of Senator Fain or Representative Stambaugh will come out with something about blockchain in one of their proposed laws. I'm guessing. I haven't spoken to either one of them, but that would be my guess.
So that's when the legislative aspect will actually start to be rolled out.
I think 2019, and it'll probably be around identity management. That would be my guess.
Right.
Because you got to have identity management before you can even do voting.
Well, you have to have the identity management to actually do almost any of these things, exactly. whether it's issued by a state or if you're in a financial transaction. Let's say I'm with Morgan Stanley and you're with, Bank of America, just arbitrarily naming two banks. They're validating us even if we're doing something on the blockchain. What
could happen? New York just has a couple of young legislators who have been proposing legislation to study these things. And that could very well be the first step that we get. Or it could be that IBM, which is sinking a lot of money into the Hyperledger, starts to come out with proposals that states can consider one of the things that a company the size of an IBM can do is put together proposed legislation or proposed models. And I think that will help quite a bit.
Now, one of the things you mentioned is that these are all being spearheaded by these young legislators. Do you think there will be pushback by these, and I'm trying to choose a nice word, let's say these legacy legislators? Is there going to be a pushback and say, well, we don't really need this? I mean, what is your feeling about that?
Mostly.
Because some legislators are there for 20 and 30 years or more.
So most legislators are overwhelmed by the amount of detail that they have to deal with. I mean, we're not even a very large state compared to New York, and that we're talking about hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bills that come through. And so the way in which the process works is you have study groups, which lead to caucus reviews, which lead to legislative body reviews. At some point, a department like mine in Commerce or the governor would get involved and advocate for this. And the older folks, as you identify them, they tend to be more skeptical, but it doesn't mean that they're not open to the idea. And largely, it's an education process, and it's a big one because blockchain. I have briefed legislators and elected officials. It's a hard concept. when you start talking about a distributed ledger that's got crypto security and it's effectively not controlled by anybody, they start to go, kind of a what you talking about kind of response, right?
Yes, they do have those conversations. It's a very funny thing the way you described that. Well, do you feel that there is, anything that's going to? I mean, I was reading an article today that, and it was an article that was kind of suggesting um, that it was already 2019, and the article was basically that 10 years after the launch of Bitcoin, which is the current implementation of the technology blockchain as we now understand it. Do you think that we're going to find ourselves going like, well, it was an interesting technology and maybe we just really didn't need to deploy it at all? Do you think there's going to be that kind of viewpoint out there?
No, I think the reality is that paper-based record keeping has exceeded its useful life, and digital record keeping is already we're migrating to that, and the question is, will blockchain overcome a bunch of the proprietary database solutions that are out there? And there's a lot of reasons, maybe not in the U.S., but in more volatile economies where blockchain just it guarantees that after you've been invaded for the fourth time in 10 years that you still know what the property records look like. And
Right.
In the volatile economies, I don't see how blockchain can't end up being the standard. In the more established economies, it will probably take longer because there's not the exigence, there's not this pushing compulsion to do this. But I think it'll have to happen. I just don't know that it will be blockchain. I think there are already some emerging technologies that are going to compete with blockchain.
Oh, such as?
Oh, I was afraid if I said something, you would ask me.
Well, you led that wide open. That's the only question I have to ask.
It's one of those things where I saw a story about it on Flipboard. I read the first two paragraphs and then marked it for later retrieval, and I haven't read it yet.
Good answer. Good answer. Well, here's then kind of like the one of the final questions I have for you. One of the things that you brought forward is that you have two legislators in the state of Washington that one from each party that are kind of spearheading this. Do you think that there'll be inter-party disputes in terms of its implementation, or do you think that they're going to treat it more agnostically about this is the best solution for the citizens of Washington, and we want to try to make something that works for everybody and not have politics to play a part of it? Or do you think that somehow politics are going to creep back into this and all of a sudden we're going to find ourselves disputing and arguing over, I don't know, the number of nodes in a blockchain?
Yeah. Well, by the way, they're both the ones I mentioned are Republicans, but there are some Democrats. I just didn't mention the Ds who are interested but haven't been as focused as those two. I don't think this is a partisan issue. I think this will end up like many things. There's stakeholders who see an inherent benefit to blockchain. There are stakeholders who are threatened by that. The title companies, for example, made it that the best response to blockchain is to try to kill it. Who knows, right? But that's the nature of politics and the way in which political debate and discourse happens. But I just don't see this as a partisan issue. I see this more as a stakeholder issue. So I think what will happen is there's a lot of skepticism about blockchain. I mean, for God's sakes, Bitcoin doesn't even have an efficient block writing methodology. Agree.
And they won't fix it. Absolutely insane that they won't even fix it. I mean, I was just looking at the Bitcoin, the cost per transaction, and I looked at it about a week ago, and it was $140 per Bitcoin transaction, and now it's over $160 for the transaction cost.
Yep.
I was like, insanity, absolute insanity.
So much for frictionless transactions, right?
Right. Well, let's see. I'm going to go buy that $5 Starbucks, and it's going to cost me $165.
Well, that's because a Bitcoin is as a function of the street value of a Bitcoin. But
That's true.
yeah, I totally get that. And I think what could happen here is the legislators say, you know what, the technology is not mature enough yet, and we're going to wait until the technology actually settles down. I would argue that the way in which the Bitcoin block is written and the fact that they've already had one fork tells you that there's a lot of instability, and governments don't want to be on the bleeding edge. They, state of Washington, we have a very progressive governor. He's very forward thinking around technology, but he doesn't want to make a bad bet.
Right. Well, that's institutional risk, I'm sure.
Yeah. So my guess will be, you were saying 10 years from now. I think maybe by 2021, 2022, we'll start to see some incremental movement in the use of blockchain by governments beyond what Delaware is already doing, which is kind of low fruit, actually. But we could do that. We register businesses so they can get a business license. We call it a UBI here, their identifier, and we could potentially maybe take a chance and try to put that on a blockchain. But a lot of it will depend on what the legislators have an appetite for doing, and we're also constrained by the fact that it's hard to balance the budget. It's probably true in New Jersey too, and as
every state,
yeah. Right? And so this is going to cost some money, and it has to be prioritized against all the other competing interests.
Well, there's an argument that could be made that blockchain will actually disrupt the employees of the states. Do you think that there might be that kind of pushback, saying like, hey, look, this is going to eliminate my job, and so I really don't want to support it?
I haven't seen any of that yet. So we do have, you mentioned AI earlier, we do have people whose job, and I'm one of them, to think about what AI is going to do in terms of the workforce. But I haven't seen anybody come out with a model that suggests blockchain will eliminate government workers. I'm sure there's some instances of it, but it just isn't widespread yet.
Right. Well, I'd like to then kind of end this by circling back to how we started this conversation. We talked about the number of universities that are actually doing something in the blockchain space. Now, you having a very unique point of view and perspective because of your prior academic career. Why do you think that the academic and the university markets are so slow on something that could be so transformational?
Well, I think we mentioned Duke earlier. Duke
Yes.
now I believe has a pretty healthy curriculum around not just how crypto works, but and how it might work in a digital economy, but actually the technology of a chain and the block and how that could be applied to other sectors. And I can't remember the number of courses. I thought it was a 3-course sequence that they had. So
they have a 2. What I saw recently was that it was a 2-course sequence.
Okay, probably needs to be 3. But that 2-course sequence, Duke is a role model. Other universities could easily adopt something like that.
Right.
They come together. University academics come together at things like EDUCAUSE to talk about curriculum and issues. And this could very well just be late. Everybody's late to this because they're not quite sure that people will hire, or they weren't sure. I think now they're more sure. But if you offer a course in blockchain or 2 courses in blockchain, and students invest their parents' money on this or their own money on this, what's the payoff? Well, I don't think it was apparent until this year. I think when Bitcoin went from 1,000 to 17,000, people began to realize, oh, it's not just about the cryptocurrency. That's interesting in its own right, but it's about the enabling technology for this.
Well, my understanding is of most academic processes is that even if you had something that was of high interest, that the physical process of getting through courses and approvals through the academic labyrinth is sometimes a year or two in the making. I mean, and that's fast tracked. I mean, I've heard of courses that's taken much longer just for a single course, let alone something, that would be technology based.
So that's a fair observation, except every major has special topics courses that don't require that kind of review. So you're absolutely right. By the time you propose a course and it goes to the review and it becomes a standardized part of the curriculum, that could be 2 years. But every program that I'm aware of allows special topics so that either at a senior level or a graduate level or maybe even a junior level, students can enroll in something that's so hot, so new, so interesting that there hasn't been time for curriculum review.
Right.
And I believe that's probably how Duke got it through. And my belief is that most universities that have they have to have faculty that can teach these courses. So if they've got the folks, I'm going to guess they're going through special topics as a way to get it out. It's not as bad as you make it sound.
Well, the thing that's been frustrating is I've been talking about blockchain for a long time, and one of the things that we do, a sister company does, is we work with universities, and so I've actually been in front of a lot of academics at the university level, and I've been telling them, you guys have got to start talking about blockchain, and I've been doing that for more than 2 years, and I mean 2 academic cycles, 2 academic years,
right.
And it surprises me that they're like, oh, well, we're kind of getting around to it. And I'm like, seriously, you guys have got to start to be a little more responsive to, the way the industry moves. And it's moving faster than you guys are. And that's not a good sign that you're taking forever.
But, I was there. I was a professor back in the .com era. And
right.
I can remember when we offered our first HTML programming class, the web had been out there for 3 years. It takes a while for academics to react to shifts in the marketplace. And some shifts are just temporary, as you mentioned earlier. And you don't want to pivot to something that's going to go away. So they tend to be slow. But once the demand is actually proven to be there, I mean, the universities, they're revenue generating institutions that want to provide classes that students will take. And so I think right now, if you drop some blockchain classes out in continuing ed or in executive education, you get pretty large enrollment.
Do you think, though, that it's going to be blockchain, or do you think that it's going to be crypto that is going to be gathering the attention of the students?
Crypto is more of if I was teaching investment theory or financial markets, crypto would become part of that class. In a continuing ed scenario, crypto could be its own standalone course. But can I envision a time in which crypto becomes a standalone course at Wharton or Stanford or Harvard? It doesn't really rise to that level, does it?
Well, again, I'm only asking simply because so often I'm asked, I need to have blockchain developers, and so I start to inquire because that's one of the things that we do is we train people to work in blockchain, and they come back to me and they're just saying, there isn't enough, and it's getting worse because every blockchain developer is leaving the regular humdrum, the big institutional type of blockchain work simply because they're seeing these riches over on the crypto side. And it's only creating a situation where we're already dealing with a dearth of talented developers simply because now there's this attention. It's just pulling them away. I mean, I just look at it and I'm going like, it's crazy. I mean, it's the Wild West. It's on some levels from my perspective.
No, it absolutely is. And that's why having a blockchain academy makes sense, because in this moment in the market, you're able to step in and provide a service that the universities and the community colleges can't do yet, right? And in the future, you're going to be able to react probably more quickly and pivot to whatever the opportunity is than the traditional academics are able to do. But yeah, I'm sure most of your students are not going through the Blockchain Academy as a way to substitute for their computer science education.
No, they're actually they're graduate. I mean, they're undergraduate. They're graduates with their undergraduate degree is the most attention. But I'm even getting though a lot of people who are coming to us from a corporate. They're going like, I don't want to be made redundant, and I really want to be able to have now a new skill set because I know that at some point my company that I work for is going to be pivoting or at least piloting things, and I want to be a part of that versus, made part of that redundant component. I mean, in the financial sector, it's estimated that every major financial firm has 40,000 legacy systems. Well, blockchain has the potential to actually replace all of them. Not that it will, but it has the potential to. But that would mean then that a lot of these people who have these very niche skills are going to be unemployed.
Well, think about it this way. Suppose you're a dev for a hospital system. And right now,
hospitals, please. That's going to be a huge area of blockchain development.
But right now, you're probably working with Cerner or one of the other patient record management systems. And if you're trying to pivot your career properly, do you want to be the Cerner person or do you want to be the person trying to figure out blockchain? I mean, what has just got more upside to your career?
That's a tough question.
I don't think it's the Cerner stuff, to be honest.
It's not, but I mean, that's the safest one.
That is the safest one. So it all depends on what your affinity for risk is in terms of your career. And I would be super interested in, if it were me, super interested in blockchain or telemedicine or some other new model that's about to disrupt the either the service provider or the payment side of the healthcare industry, because that's where all the investment dollars are going to go. And I can tell you from my time at Microsoft and Sun Microsystems, you don't want to be the developer on Microsoft Exchange because that's an old product and there's no real way to build a career around that. You want to be the developer on Azure or something like that where it's sexy and increases your market value. Well, blockchain right now is one of those things on your resume that makes you more valuable, but there is risk attached to it, and that risk is, well, what if blockchain doesn't actually make it? And who knows, right? That's the game.
That is a huge question. And with that, I want to thank you for showing up and being a guest here on Blockchain 360. And do you have a Twitter account?
I do. It's at Rudar, I'm going to spell it wrong, RHUDAUR.
That's great. So any of my listeners can actually follow you now. I really want to thank you for spending the time and having this discussion with me on blockchain. And it was such a pleasure to meet you in Santa Clara. And I wish you the best. And maybe in a year, what we can do is have a follow-up to this conversation to see how things are happening in the state of Washington.
We can make that happen. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
The Blockchain 360 podcast is produced weekly. Have a question? Want us to interview someone specific? Wish to hear about a particular topic? Let us know. You can email podcast@blockchain360.co or tweet us on Twitter @blockchain360 or at our website blockchain360.co.